Thursday night, the gym buzzed like it always did. Heavy bags swung from chains, fists drummed their own rhythm into leather, and sweat clung to the air like smoke in a locker room. Kids grunted, trainers barked commands, and the floor thudded. Under 1,000 small collisions. In the far corner, one boy stood out, mostly because he didn't try to. Caleb, 14, wiry, quiet, methodical. His hands moved with purpose as he adjusted his shin guards. He didn't make jokes like the others, didn't flex for attention or talk smack between rounds. He watched, he listened, and when it was his turn, he gave it everything. Coach Trent strutted across the mat like he owned every breath in the building, towering, loud, and never missing a moment to remind people who ran this place. He called for a break. Kids dropped to the floor, laughing, gasping, reaching for water bottles. Caleb stayed on his feet, stretching in silence. A nudge broke his focus. One of the older students leaned over with a smirk. "So why'd you start? To MMA anyway? You don't really look like the fighter type." Caleb hesitated. Then he answered, not with bravado, just a quiet pride that came from somewhere deeper. "My grandpa trained Navy SEALs," he said. "He taught me the basics. He's the reason I started." The words barely hit the air before the laughter started. Short at first, then bigger, louder. One kid let out a mock gasp. "What is he? Some Hollywood stunt guy?" another quipped. Even Coach Trent, wiping sweat off his brow with a towel, turned toward the commotion with a smirk curling on his lips. "What's this I hear? Grandpa was training SEALs now?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. Caleb straightened, not confrontational, just honest. "Yes, sir. He trained with them back in Coronado. He doesn't talk about it much, but..." Trent cut him off with a loud laugh that rolled across the gym like thunder. "You think we're going to believe that kind of fairy tale? Boy, this is a gym, not a movie set." The kids erupted again. One pretended to salute. Another made fake explosion sounds. Caleb stood in the middle of it all, fists clenched, eyes fixed. On the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He didn't back down either. Trent stepped closer, dropping his voice just enough to make it sting. "You want to earn respect here? Don't do it by name-dropping fantasy stories. Do it by, putting in the work." "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," Caleb said, voice soft but firm. Trent's smirk vanished. Then came the moment. The sound cracked through the gym like a whip. Trent's hand, fast and unprovoked, slapped across Caleb's cheek. Caleb stumbled. One hand going to his face, but he didn't cry, didn't scream. He just stood there, red blooming across his skin like spilled ink. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. No more laughter, just breathless stillness. A few students shifted, glanced at each other, uncomfortable now. But Trent didn't notice. Or didn't care. He turned away. Enough fooling around, back to work. Caleb moved to the far corner. He tied his gloves tighter, even though no one told him to spar. His face burned, but his hands stayed steady. The rest of the class passed in awkward silence. No one spoke to him. When the session ended, kids filed out laughing again, like nothing had happened. But Caleb didn't join them. He packed his gear alone, gaze never lifting from the mat. He didn't say goodbye. Outside, the sky was dipped in orange and bruised purple. Caleb walked the long way home. No earbuds, no phone, just the slap still echoing behind his eyes. Just footsteps. Just shame. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that something had already begun. A shift in the air, a slow, steady storm that didn't make noise, yet. The gate creaked quietly as Caleb pushed it open. The house was bathed in amber light from the setting sun, and the front yard smelled like soil and summer air. By the tomato plants, a man knelt, faded flannel shirt, worn cap low over silver hair. He was brushing dirt from the stem of a young plant, his movements slow, intentional. He didn't look up, not at first. Caleb closed the gate behind him. No words, no dragging feet. Just the quiet thud of his gym bag against his side as he walked toward the porch. Then Chuck looked up. His eyes scanned Caleb's face. The mark was impossible to miss. A red, uneven handprint bloomed across one cheek. raw around the edges. But Chuck didn't ask. Didn't know the gym ended early today, he said, still crouched. Caleb stopped at the steps. It didn't. Chuck stood slowly, dusting his hands off on his pants. The air was thick between them, not with tension, but weight. The kind of weight that knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. He opened the screen door without another word. Wash your hands, dinner's almost ready. Inside, everything smelled like garlic and home. Caleb dropped his bag by the wall and moved toward the sink. Chuck walked past the stove, opened a small wooden cabinet and pulled out a round, time-worn object. He placed it gently on the table. A coin. Military issue. Old but not forgotten. The kind you don't show unless it means something. Caleb turned from the sink and froze when he saw it. He walked slowly toward the table. You remember what this is? Chuck asked, voice low. Caleb nodded. You said they only gave it to instructors who completed the full SEAL combat program. Back when you taught in Coronado, Chuck leaned in, both palms on the table. The coin sat between them like a relic. You shown this to anyone? No, sir. Chuck exhaled through his nose. Good. Some people don't need to know who you are until the moment they do. Caleb didn't ask anything else. He just stood still, silent, letting those words settle deep. Chuck stepped away toward the stove. Finish your dinner. We've got somewhere to be in the morning. The next morning arrived with pale light cutting through the old kitchen curtains. Caleb sat at the table, cereal in front of him, spoon untouched. The mark on his cheek had faded some, but the shape still lingered. Less bruise, more memory. Chuck sipped his coffee without a word. The only sounds were the hum of the fridge and the creak of the floorboards beneath them. Eventually, Chuck stood, placed his cup in the sink and said, Put on your shoes. We're leaving in 15. Caleb blinked. Where are we going? Chuck didn't answer. He disappeared into the hallway with a quiet click of the door. 15 minutes later, they were in the truck. Caleb wore the same MMA shirt from the night before. His fingers toyed with the collar, still stretched from anxiety. Chuck drove without turning the radio up, without small talk. The silence wasn't cold. It was full, like something sacred was coming. They pulled into the small parking lot. The gym stood quiet in the morning light. Caleb hesitated. I don't have class today, Chuck nodded. I know, that was all. They stepped out of the truck. Chuck didn't walk like someone with a grudge. He walked like someone with purpose. Slow, even, controlled. Time didn't rush him. It obeyed him. Inside the gym, the day had just begun. A few students were already sparring in the back. The air smelled of yesterday's sweat and padded ambition. Coach Trent stood in the center, arms folded, watching two teens throw lazy kicks at each other. The door chimed. Trent looked up. Well, look who came back, he said, just loud enough. Didn't get enough yesterday, huh? Some students turned, one or two smirked, others kept training. Then they noticed the man beside Caleb. Older, quiet, weathered but not frail. He didn't say a word, just walked to the edge of the mat. Hands in his pockets, back straight, eyes steady. Caleb stood beside him, unsure. Chuck didn't nod, didn't gesture, just stood. And the energy in the room shifted, and the energy in the room shifted. Chuck didn't return the stare Coach Trent shot his way. He simply scanned the room. The scuffed mats, the faded posters, the dull hum of bag chains swinging gently in the back corner. Trent crossed his arms and barked, You here to complain? File something? Or you just want to spectate? Chuck didn't blink. I'm just here to observe, he said, voice calm as steel. But if you're done running your mouth, I might have a few thoughts to share later. The tone wasn't loud, wasn't a threat, but it hit the air like the snap of a broken bone. Trent scoffed. This is my gym, old man. You got opinions? Take 'em back to your rocking chair. Chuck said nothing. He turned to Caleb instead. Go warm up. Caleb blinked. Me? Chuck gave a single nod. There was no confusion in the instruction. Just expectation. Caleb obeyed. He moved to the far edge of the mat, removed his shoes and began the stretches Chuck had taught him years ago. Behind the garage, by the riverbank, on nights when stories weren't told but lived through quiet repetition. The room watched in patches of curiosity and discomfort. Some tried to return to training, but eyes kept shifting, from Caleb's sharp, focused movements to the older man who hadn't moved from his place by the wall. Trent paced slowly. "You trying to prove something, old man?" Chuck's eyes didn't move. "I'm not here to prove anything. That's your game." "What, you think I don't know what I'm doing?" Chuck finally met his eyes. "I think you hit a kid for telling the truth. And then you made a room laugh with you. That's not coaching, that's hiding." The gym fell still. Again. A few students paused mid-drill, gloves lowered. One of the younger boys whispered under his breath, just loud enough to catch wind. "I think that's Chuck Norris." The whisper spread like heat. Phones began to lift, subtle, almost disguised as checking messages. But the camera apps were open. Recording. Trent rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. Chuck Norris? That guy's probably holed up in a cabin somewhere polishing trophies." Chuck tilted his head. "I don't polish trophies," he said evenly. "I build character, or at least I try to." Trent stepped closer. "If you're really him, prove." Chuck's voice remained steady. "I'm not here to prove anything to you. But if you insist on disrespecting my grandson, I'll gladly show you why that was your last mistake." Gasps echoed. A few students instinctively stepped back. Chuck reached into his back pocket, pulled out something small and square. He held it up between two fingers. A faded Navy SEAL trident patch. The edges worn, initials stitched into the corner. "This used to mean something," Chuck said softly. "Still does. But it's not mine that matters. It's the one your student was trying to honor yesterday." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hand. But for the first time since yesterday, no one was laughing. The room held its breath. Not a word. Not a punch thrown. Just the steady thump of Caleb's footfalls on the mat and the weight of something unspoken pressing down on every chest. Chuck didn't move. He stood exactly where he had when he handed Trent the trident patch. His hands remained in his pockets, eyes scanning slowly, measuring not just posture and form, but character. Coach Trent couldn't take it. The silence, the attention shifting away from him. He stepped forward, his voice louder than it needed to be. "You think standing there makes you better than me?" he challenged. Chuck didn't answer. Trent's voice rose again, this time sharper. "I've trained champions. I built this place from nothing." Chuck tilted his head. Calm. "You built it on fear." A few gasps rippled. The sentence wasn't shouted. It was simply true, and everyone in the room felt it. Trent took another. "Steve, you don't know me." Chuck's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough." Then from the back of the room, a murmur, a whisper, like static catching flame. "I think it really is Chuck Norris." The air shifted again. Several students lowered their gloves. Others glanced toward their phones, hands twitching toward record buttons. Trent laughed, but it came, outforced, hollow. "Chuck Norris, give me a break." Chuck slowly removed his cap and folded it, placing it gently on a bench. He didn't rush, didn't posture, just stepped toward the mat. "I don't do stunts," he said. "I don't do shows, but I do protect my family." He stepped onto the mat. Trent snorted and cracked his neck. "All right, old man. Let's dance." Chuck said nothing. He squared his stance. Not rigid, not flamboyant, just grounded, like he'd done it 1,000 times in silence, in dust, in places without cheering crowds. Trent bounced lightly, raising his fists. "I hope Medicare covers this." One beat of silence, then another. Trent lunged. What happened next was almost too fast for the room to register. Chuck moved like water, slipping under the punch. His heel pivoted, leg swept. Trent stumbled before he could hit the floor. Chuck caught his arm and redirected the fall, locking it into a clean submission hold. Not enough to injure, just enough to end it. Trent's face smacked lightly against the mat. He grunted, breath knocked from his chest, disbelief wide in his eyes. Chuck released him. Trent rolled over, gasping. "You got lucky." Chuck stepped back. No, you got arrogant. Silence fell again. The kind that didn't beg to be broken. From the far wall, Caleb stood frozen, his gloves half-laced. His eyes locked on the man he'd eaten dinner with just the night before. And for the first time since the slap, his shoulders lifted. Chuck turned to the room. Not to brag, not to bask. This isn't about showing off, he said. It's about knowing when to stay standing and when to kneel. Not because someone forces you, but because you choose to honor something greater than yourself. He walked over to Trent, who now sat rubbing his wrist, humiliated. I didn't come here to embarrass you, Chuck said. But you laid a hand on my grandson and made him feel small for telling the truth. That's not teaching, that's cowardice, in a coach's uniform. Trent didn't respond. Chuck turned his gaze to the students, the same ones who had laughed the day before. Now, many of them looked down. You want to be fighters? Chuck asked. Then learn to protect those who can't fight back yet. Just then the door creaked open. A woman with a press badge stepped in. Behind her a camera crew. One of the students had tipped them off. The moment was no longer private. Chuck didn't look at the cameras. He didn't speak again. He simply walked toward Caleb and whispered, We're not done here. He held his hand out. Caleb took it. Not because he needed help standing, but because he needed to know someone still stood with him. They turned and walked out of the spotlight. Just as the world turned its lens toward them. The video clip was just 28 seconds. A blurry smartphone recording from the corner of the gym, shaky at first, then focusing just in time to catch Coach Trent lunging, and Chuck moving like wind through water. A sweep, a shift, a hold. Then silence. By the time Caleb and Chuck returned home, it had already crossed 10,000 views. The title was simple: Old Man Destroys MMA Coach for Hitting Grandson. Chuck didn't react. He poured tea, sat on the porch, watched the horizon fade into blue-black. Caleb sat beside him, the trident coin resting in his palm. He hadn't spoken since they left the gym. Inside the gym, whispers had turned into murmurs, then murmurs into conversations. Is he really Chuck Norris? Did Trent actually hit that kid yesterday? That patch, I've only ever seen that in documentaries. Trent tried to carry on like normal, but his wrist throbbed, his voice cracked when he barked orders. And worst of all, Basui students had stopped laughing. The next morning, someone posted screenshots of a Venmo request. Coach said if I didn't bring in 2 new students this month, I had to pay double. Another posted a message thread. Extra fee this week. Mandatory. Don't ask questions. Then came the girl with the dark ponytail. He told me if I didn't stay late and clean the floors, I'd get benched. I'm 14. It didn't take long. A local journalist shared the original video. Then another picked it up. Then a local station ran it with a segment. MMA coach under fire after video surfaces of assault. Alleged exploitation. By the time Chuck stepped back into the gym 2 days later, no cameras, no crew, just him. The place had changed. Trent stood behind the desk, arms folded, trying to act like nothing had happened. But even his posture betrayed him. His voice wavered. You think this makes you the hero? He snapped. You humiliated me. Chuck didn't raise his voice. You humiliated yourself the moment you struck a child. He turned to the corkboard. On the wall, the one labeled Certified Master Instructor. He pulled the frame down, flipped it over. Fake. Printed off an old template site. The signature didn't match any real association. Chuck held it up. You forged this? Trent said nothing. Then a student stepped forward. Marcus, older, once loud. He pointed at the certificate. He made us call him Sensei, even when we weren't in class. Said it built discipline. But really, it just shut us up. Chuck set the frame down. Walked to the center of the mat. He didn't need to say much. I'm not taking over this place. That's not why I came. But if you want to rebuild what's been broken here, start by erasing his name. He turned to the whiteboard, wiped off Coach Trent in dry marker streaks. In its place he wrote, Earn honor. Then he stepped back. Caleb stood by the doorway watching. Chuck walked to him. Held out the coin. It's yours now, he said. Not because of what happened on that mat, but because of how you stood afterward. Caleb took it. No fanfare, no applause, only truth. Later that day, a reporter stopped them outside the parking lot. "Mr. Norris, do you have a statement for the media?" Chuck didn't stop walking, but he turned just enough to answer. This was never about proving anything. It's about what happens when people confuse power with permission. Behind them, inside the gym, parents had started arriving. Some holding their kids' gear, others holding questions. One mother pointed at the payment chart pinned to the E. "I paid $600 this month, and they said my kid still wasn't doing enough." Another, "They charged me to keep his belt, said it was a storage fee." The gym that had once been loud with drills and laughter now buzzed with reckoning. Chuck didn't look back. The story had already left the building, and outside something else had started. A movement. Not loud, but real. It started with 3 kids in a backyard. No walls, no logos, no shouting. Just morning light cutting through the trees, an old patch of grass and a single mat unrolled like a prayer rug at the foot of a porch. Caleb led the warm-ups. His voice was soft but steady. The same boy who once stood silent in a corner now stood tall, calling out reps with a calm rhythm that others naturally followed. His footwork was sharper, his hands more certain. But it wasn't the movement that held the others. It was the quiet way he moved, like he belonged. Chuck stood at the edge, arms crossed. He didn't interfere. He watched. Occasionally, he stepped in to correct a stance or offer a gesture. A shift of the heel, a tilt of the chin. That was all. By the end of the first week, word had spread. More kids came, some on bikes, others with their parents trailing behind, unsure but curious. No money was asked, no contracts signed. Just one rule: show up and respect the space. A reporter returned, same woman from the gym incident. This time, no cameras. Just a small notebook and a single question. "Why now?" Chuck looked at the group running drills on the lawn. Then he answered simply, "Because someone finally needed me to." That night, another clip hit the internet. But this time it wasn't of Chuck. It was of a 15-year-old boy named Malik. He sat in his bedroom speaking directly to the camera. "I used to think yelling made me stronger. I thought pain meant I was learning. But I was just afraid to speak. Then I saw what happened with Caleb. And Mr. Norris didn't scream. He didn't punch harder. He just stood up. That's what real strength looks like." The video went viral, not because of action, but because of clarity. Within days, more kids came forward, some with receipts, some with stories. Some just stood, in quiet solidarity, wearing duct-taped patches over old gym logos. Eventually, the National Martial Arts Federation released a public statement. Coach Trent's license was revoked, his affiliations severed. The gym stayed locked. The lights never came back on. Meanwhile, in Chuck's backyard, grass wore down from footwork patterns. Water bottles lined the fence, and one day, after a particularly long session, a girl approached him with a folder. "We got signatures," she said. "We want to rent a space, make this real." Chuck looked out over the lawn. Caleb was helping a younger boy tape his hands. "You know why this works?" Chuck asked. She blinked. "Because of you." He shook his head. "Because no one's trying to be the loudest voice. Everyone just shows up for the right reason." She smiled. "So, is that a yes?" Chuck took the folder, opened it, closed it. "It's a maybe." Caleb trained in silence, but it wasn't the same silence from before, the kind that grew from isolation, from shame, from being ignored. This was a new kind of quiet, focused, rooted, confident. He moved with presence now, not to prove anything, just to become what he was meant to be. The coin never left his pocket. It wasn't a trophy, it wasn't a badge. It was a weight, a reminder, something to ground him when the voices got too loud or the doubts crept in. A cool circle of metal he could press his fingers against and remember, the moment he didn't back down. After practice one afternoon, a parent approached Chuck as he folded chairs. She stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "My son, he's never looked people in the eye before. Now he does. Chuck didn't say anything, just nodded once, stacked another chair. Later that evening, the sky began to blush with fading sunlight. Caleb was already in the yard, laying out mats. Before anyone arrived, the grass was flattened in familiar places now. The cones were set. The gloves were lined up. Chuck walked over, slow as always, a glass of water in one hand. He didn't say anything at first. Then, from his pocket, he pulled out the coin. He held it between two fingers and looked at Caleb. "You know why I gave you this?" Caleb shrugged. "Because I got back up?" Chuck nodded. "Not because you were ready, but because you were willing." He placed the coin in Caleb's palm again. "And when someone else needs it more than you do, you'll know what to do." They sat together for a while after that, watching the sun melt behind the trees. The voices of kids began drifting through the gate, some laughing, some quiet, all of them arriving early. Caleb stood. Chuck stayed seated. "You ever think about reopening a real gym?" Caleb asked, stretching his arms. Chuck looked out at the dirt and grass and worn-down mat. "This is a real gym," he said. Caleb smiled, because he knew Chuck was right. The slap wasn't the story, the step after it was. As the last light faded and stars began to peek out, Chuck watched the first kids begin warm-ups without being told. He folded his arms, leaned back. "You carry it," he said quietly, "until someone else needs it more." And then he said nothing else. But what neither of them knew was that someone was already watching, and he had his own story to tell. To be continued.